Here's how you can buy 3 properties in just 5 years with your house and $500 a week. And it's actually not as hard as you think, because this is the same process my team uses to help hundreds of Kiwi couples start their property portfolios every year. And I actually use this exact strategy to buy 6 properties by the age of 32. So in this video, first you're going to learn how realistic this actually is. Then I'll walk you through each of the 3 properties, what to buy, when to buy, and the strategy behind each one, because that way, by the end, you'll know how to start actually doing this yourself. So here's where you're starting from. You're in your early 40s, you and your partner have a combined income of 160 grand a year, so you earn 80K a year each. That is the average for Auckland. You bought your home a few years ago, and let's say today it's worth about $800,000. And on top of that, you've got a mortgage of, we'll call it $310,000, which is the average house price and the average mortgage in New Zealand. So this is pretty much a typical Kiwi couple. Now, what this means is that you've got $490,000 worth of equity sitting within that property. And on top of that, we're going to say that you'd have the ability to save $500 a week going forward. So that's going to be your buffer. So $500 a week over a year, 26 grand a year, over 5 years, that adds up to 130K. Now you don't have to have that up front. I'm saying you're saving that over time. So that's our starting line. Nothing special, just a pretty typical normal Kiwi household. So how do you turn that into your first investment property? Because remember, you don't have a big cash deposit. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is you can use the wealth that you've got in this house for the deposit for that investment property. Because if you wanted to go out and buy a car and you didn't have the cash for it, you could go and get a loan top up on your house from the bank, borrow the money, use the cash to go buy a car. And what a lot of people don't realize is you can actually do the same to go and buy your first investment property. And the way this works is that banks will typically lend up to 80% of the value on your own home. Now, 80% of 800K, that means you can borrow up to $640,000 against your own property. But the thing you've got to realize is that you still owe $310K on your mortgage, right? You've already got your mortgage. So you go $640K minus 310, and that means you've got $330,000 worth of what we call usable equity. So that's going to be where we get the deposit from for the investment property. Now, if you wanted to spend all of that $330K, take it out, and use that as the deposit for investment properties, well, how much would you be able to go and spend? Well, it kind of depends on what sort of property you're going to go and invest in. So if you go and invest in an existing property, you're going to need a 30% deposit. And so the way you figure out what's the most existing properties I could spend is you take your 330K and you multiply it by 3.3. So 330K multiplied by 3.3, the most you could spend on existing investment properties is $1.1 million. Now with a new build, you only need a 20% deposit. And so what you do is you go 20%. If you want to figure out the maximum you could spend, at least from a deposit perspective, is you take your 330K, multiply it by 5, and that means the most you could spend is $1.65 million in total. Now, you're not actually going to go out and blow it all on one property, because otherwise you're tapped out, you can't spend any more. But what you might do is, from this 330K, you might take out $120,000 as the deposit for your first property, and we keep the rest aside for your next ones. And so if we take that 120K, we could then use that, multiply it by 5, and buy a $600,000 new house. So 120K from our own house. The bank's going to lend us another $480,000. They're going to lend that against that new house that we're going to buy up here. And that means the value is going to be $600,000. You've bought that with no cash. Now, you might be wondering why I've been talking a bit about new builds here. Well, on top of the deposits, there are 2 other things that the bank is going to look for. The first is, can you afford it? So this is what we in the business called uncommitted monthly income, or UMI. And this is basically the same whether it is a new build or an existing property. The bank is going to make sure you can afford the mortgage. The second thing they're going to look at is your debt to income ratios. Now, this comes from the Reserve Bank, and if you invest in existing properties, the most you can possibly get is 7 times your income. That's the most amount of mortgages you can get out. But if you're investing in new builds, you actually don't need to follow those specific rules, which makes it a little bit easier to get your mortgage approved if you go new on top of those deposit rules. But how do you know how many properties you could actually buy over the next 5, 10, 15 years? Well, this is the actual tool I use to map it out. And the reason I built this is that if you buy your first investment property and you do it today, and let's say this is exactly what you're going to do, 2 things are going to happen likely over time. The first is it will probably go up in value over the long term, and that's going to make it a little bit easier for you to go and purchase your next property because you've got some more equity within this property. The second thing that will often happen is that the rent on that property will increase as well. And what that means is that eventually your investment properties can help you get more investment properties because they've gone up in value and the cash flow improves over time. Now, the other thing that happens is that over time you're going to pay off your own home. Typically, you're going to pay down that mortgage. And what that means is that over time you're going to have less debt, and that's going to mean you've got more equity again to help you get into the next investment property. But it's very difficult to see that happening over time. And in the past, it was very difficult to forecast or project how many properties you might be able to purchase, which is why I built this tool. So I've plugged in your starting position here, the 800K home, the 310K mortgage, the $500 a week spare that we're saving up, and this tool forecasts how many properties you could potentially buy over the next 15 years. Now, if you want to see what your actual numbers look like, because I know these are not actually your numbers, then book a free portfolio planning session with one of my financial advisors. They'll plug in your income, your situation, show you how many properties you could potentially buy and when. I'll drop a link down in the description or scan the QR code on your screen now to book that free session. And if you did run those numbers, you'd see that in this situation, based on the numbers I've shared, you'd actually be able to buy your second investment property straight away because we've still got a lot of leftover equity in here. Once we take out that 120K for the first property, we've actually still got $210,000 worth of usable equity left. But let's say you decided to hit pause because you want to see how that first property goes. Well, fast forward 2 years, your own home likely gone up in value, your first investment property may have increased in value as well, and you've paid down some debt, you've been saving that money. Well, based on that model I just showed you, you'd have enough usable equity to do it again, and you might decide to do it 2 years after that. So 2 years in, we've now got 2 investment properties. You buy that other property, but this time you decide to buy in a different city. Perhaps this time we're going to decide to invest in Hamilton. It might be a $550,000 property, maybe renting for $520 a week. And that means you're going to need another $110,000 worth of usable equity. And I've actually done this multiple times myself, right? Where my first investment property, I think I paid $385,000 for it. A few years later, it had gone up to $580,000. So I got a registered valuation, took it to the bank, borrowed against that increased value, and I used that extra equity as the deposits on 2 more investment properties. So it's the same principles that we just walked through where property increases in value over time, not every year, but often it does over the long term. Your equity increases, the bank lets you borrow more against it, so you go ahead and buy the next one. And the reason I just said before that you might decide to buy in Hamilton in 2 years is that I can tell you my favorite areas to invest in today, but I can't forecast what my top areas will be in, say, 2 years' time. I'll need to base that on the data that's available at the time. But if you were to ask me, well, what am I looking for? Often I'm looking for areas that aren't hot right now, but those that could increase in value in the future. And this is where a lot of investors get it wrong because they chase what's hot now. So you might see Invercargill prices going off like a frog in a sock and they pile in, or they see a lot of headlines about Christchurch, that's the place to be, they pile in there. But here's what I've learned. You don't necessarily want to buy what's already gone up. In an ideal world, you'd buy what's about to go up. Let me give you an example. So 6 years ago, we were telling Kiwis on the Property Academy podcast to look at Christchurch. Now, at the time, it wasn't the hot place to invest. Christchurch had basically been flat for many, many years. And in my mind, things had got way out of whack. So everywhere else had gone up in value. And actually at that time, Wellington was going basically like this. It was going really skyward up in Wellington. Christchurch was very flat. And so people were saying, oh, I'm not sure if I want to invest in Christchurch. I see Wellington house prices going up. Maybe I'll go invest in there. But as I said, I thought things are getting out of whack here. And Christchurch looked, in my mind, about 26% undervalued, at least by my number crunching. So a lot of our clients started backing Christchurch. Since then, during the COVID period, house prices in Christchurch, they went up about 50%, 45 to 50%. They came back a bit and now they have fully recovered in Christchurch. Whereas if we look at what happened in Wellington, house prices took off and now they've come down about 30%, and the Wellington market is looking incredibly depressed, right? But the point here is Christchurch wasn't outperforming other cities. In fact, it was massively underperforming. Then things started to turn around. Now, that doesn't mean that Christchurch is the absolute place to be right now. What I'm saying is we want to look at the areas that perhaps have underperformed over the last 5 or 10 years, because that might be where there is more opportunity. Now, today, we're doing the same thing. If I run this analysis, Auckland, in my mind, looks particularly undervalued, but who knows what my top places will be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. But the principle stays the same. We're going to try and buy where the fundamentals are strong and the house prices haven't caught up yet. And if you're enjoying this video, make sure you hit the like button. That's how I know which videos to create more of, and honestly, it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribing, that helps too. You guys have already helped us create the largest property investing community in the country, and we are on our way to 50,000 subscribers. While you're down there, make sure you ring the notification bell. That way you'll hear about these videos as soon as we post them. So let's say it's another few years later, your properties could have gone up in value. You'd have paid off some more debt on your house. And so you go back to the bank and say, okay, it's time for us to buy another one. But this time, actually, it looks like you wouldn't be able to afford your next investment property because you've hit a roadblock. Because although you've got lots of equity in your house, we didn't spend all of that usable equity. You have enough deposit to buy the next rental, but it's income that's now holding you back. So at this point, you'd have about $1.5 million worth of debt. Perhaps if you've paid off some against your own home, you're now down to $300,000. We spent $600K on the first property, borrowed all of the money for it, $550K on the second investment property, add it all up, we're at about $1.45 million. And the bank's thinking, okay, that is a lot of debt when we've got $80K still earned by the two partners. We've got about $55,000 worth of income coming in from the two investment properties, so $215K. You're close to buying that next investment property, but actually income is what's holding you back. And so what many investors at this stage do is, if they haven't had a decent pay jump in a while, is they might go back and negotiate with their boss. So there was this Kiwi who was earning $90,000 a year, really good salary. But then she started researching the job market. They used this calculator from Seek to see that their pay was actually well below industry standard. And they'd taken on additional responsibilities and were delivering above expectations. And so they applied for a job at another company, just to explore their options, and they were shocked when they got an offer with a 45% salary increase. So they started earning $40,000 extra, and what that meant is they could borrow way more money for their next investment property. Now, obviously, that's not a typical scenario where all of us can just go out and get $40,000 pay rises, but it's a really good example of what is sometimes possible. And one of the strategies I legitimately see investors use all the time is going in and negotiating for that higher pay, because that does unlock more borrowing from the bank. Now, let's come back to this example. I've already run the numbers using the tool that I showed you before, and to get that final investment property in 5 years, they need about a $15,000 pay rise between the two of them. So let's say partner number one goes in and they can negotiate with their boss to get a $5,000 raise. So they're no longer on $80,000, they're now earning $85K. Let's say the other partner, partner number two, they switch employers and they can get a $10,000 raise. So they go from 80K up to 90K in total. Now, if that happens, it looks like they'd have just enough to stretch and get that third investment property, all within 5 years. And I share this example just to show you that it isn't always going to be easy, and sometimes you will have to think a little more outside of the box in order to get the 3 investment properties. But let's say you can do that. Let's say you go out and buy that property. Well, in that case, it's 5 years in the future, and that property that you're purchasing might be worth $660,000. So you put in 132 grand worth of your own equity, borrow the rest against the property. And after this, we get that 5th one in here. Let's say that you just stop buying, you just hold. Well, this is where it gets really interesting. And before I show you what happens over the next 10 years after that, I do need to talk about something, because someone's going to be in the comments saying, Ed, but these properties, based on today's yields, they could be cash flow negative, especially if you're borrowing all of that money. You could be losing money on those properties every single week. And they're kind of right. So let's actually look at what those numbers look like. Let's say that you've got rent of $27,500 per year. So that's about $530 per week. On top of that, you're going to have to be paying rates. That might cost you $3,000 a year. Insurance might cost you about $1,800 per year. Maintenance, we've got to be allocating for that. A lot of property investors I see forget about maintenance or choose not to include it. I personally think you've got to put it in there. Property management might cost you $2.5 grand per year. And then interest is going to be the big thing that it costs you. Now, I've done this based on a 4.5% interest rate. And if we add up all of those costs, this cash flow is going to be negative by about $145 per week, which means that to own that property, we do need to top up that mortgage by $145 a week. Well, why would anyone do this? Well, it's because the initial cash flow of an investment property is not really where you make money in property. So that's where our $500 a week in savings is going to go, because $145 a week across 3 properties is less than $500 a week. And then we make money in 2 different places. The first is going to be capital growth. So let's say we've got this $145 a week, we're putting that into property, but your house is worth $600,000, and let's say it goes up in value by 5% in the first year, which is much lower than the average in New Zealand. Well, on a $600,000 property, if we're going 5% increase, that is an extra $30,000 in the first year, because we've gone from $600K to $630,000. You made 30 grand in capital gains. You don't need to share any of that with the bank. Now, if these were actually the numbers and this actually happened, if you're putting in the $145 a week to get 30 grand out, for every dollar you're putting into that property, you're getting $4 back. Now, it's not every year that you're going to get 5% capital growth, right? Because some years house prices are going to go up, some years they're going to go down, sometimes they're going to stay the same. And I know that house prices aren't going up a lot at the moment. In some parts of the country, they are in others, like Invercargill, Christchurch, Southland, Queenstown, and Ashburton. But over the long term, house prices tend to go up. So I'll give you a really good example of my co-host on the Property Academy podcast. His name's Andrew. And he bought a property with his parents in Kaiapoi. Now, that was back in 2007, the absolute peak of the market before the GFC. He got his parents to invest with him, and the 3 of them decided to buy a house together. They paid $395,000. Well, by the time that property was built, because he bought a new build, the market had dipped. It was only worth $370,000. Well, imagine how he felt at the time. He would have felt absolutely sick. He'd got his parents involved. He'd told them that investing in property was a good idea. And that first year, it went down in value by $25,000. Well, they decided to hold. They didn't sell. They didn't panic. And 15 years later, they sold that property for more than double what they had paid. And so you might not make a lot of money in the first year, but the longer you hold, the more money you are likely to make, because it might be $30,000 in the first year. If it goes up by another 5% the next year, that's about $31,500, because we start to get the effect of compounding capital growth. After that, it's about an extra $33,000, maybe $32,000. Then on top of that, the next year looks to be about $36,000, because we're getting the compounding effect. Again, it doesn't happen smoothly in a line like this, but over time, it tends to happen. The second way you can make money is through your cash flow. So when you are at the very start, your mortgage is making up the biggest part of your costs, right? This is your debt, this is your interest costs here, and often they're very high. But what tends to happen over time is your rent goes up Again, not always in a straight line. There'll be some flat periods, but rents tend to increase over time. And as long as your interest rate stays constant, your debt repayments stay exactly the same, which is why over time, people's cash flow tends to improve on investment properties because rents tend to go up relatively consistently, but your mortgage, certainly the principal of your mortgage, isn't increasing over time. All right. Here's the portfolio that we ended up with. So if you did this for all 5 years, we bought the 3 investment properties. By year 5, they'd be worth about $2.01 million. And at that point, you'd have about $1.81 million worth of debt. The reason there's a difference between the two of these is that we bought a property in year 1, maybe that's gone up in value a bit. We bought a property in year 2, maybe that's gone up in value a little bit as well. Now, watch what happens. So again, let's assume that house prices go up by 5% a year, compounding, the rent's going up at about 4% a year, so your cash flow is improving, your debt's staying flat. 5 years after that, if all 3 investment properties have increased by 5% a year, those properties are now worth $2.56 million. By year 10, again, you apply that same capital growth rate, you're up to $3.3 million. Now, that original $500 a week that you might have been earning in rent from your first property, 15 years in the future, that could be $750 a week. You're 55 years old, and you've got, if you look at the difference between the 3.3 million and the 1.81 million, it's about $1.49 million worth of equity within these properties, just looking at the difference between the value and the debt you've got. Plus you've got your own home, plus you've got your Kiwi saver, plus NZ Super could be carrying by the time you're 65, and all you did was buy 3 properties in your 40s and hold them. But what would $1.49 million mean for you and your portfolio and mean for your retirement? Well, one thing I often like to do is look at the rule of 4%. And what that means is that if you've got a pool of assets, you can generally reasonably safely spend 4% of it per year without running out of money. So with our almost $1.5 billion, multiply that by 4%, that means that you'd have $60,000, or you'd be able to pretty comfortably withdraw $60,000 a year in passive income for life if you sold up all of those properties. Now, again, if you want to sit down with one of my financial advisors to run these numbers for you, click the link in the description, scan the QR code on your screen to book that free session. So now you know if you could potentially buy 3 properties in 5 years and the numbers behind it, but you still need to understand how much these properties are actually going to make. So make sure you watch this next video where I'll show you how much a 600K property actually makes. Click the video on your screen. I'll see you on there.